Hi there, everybody. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi.
My name is Yamila. Hi, everybody. My name is Yamila Ruiz. So happy to be co-hosting this panel discussion tonight after just seeing myself this great film. So happy to be joined by Josh and Cheryl and Jacqueline, who are all going to provide unique perspectives as to why the film was made, what it was like being in the film, and what the real life struggle is right now for a lot of working Americans and efforts that are underway to help folks like those featured in the film today. So Josh, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Josh Gleason. I was the co-director of the Disrupted. Worked closely with Sarah Cole to develop and produce and edit the film. From the very beginning, we wanted to explore kind of the changing nature of work in the United States and how it's become increasingly difficult for Americans and American families to get ahead or even to pay their bills. And gig work seemed like a really important part of that piece. We really made it a priority from the beginning to include a story that brought to light the gig economy and what it's like to work in the gig economy, and that desire ultimately led us to Cheryl in Tampa, Florida. And so we spent, as you saw, a couple of years following Cheryl's experience as a driver. Cheryl, do you want to give
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in real quick. I was an experience, I have to say, for me. I'd never done anything like this before, so a unique experience nonetheless, but one that I felt was very important because I had already been protesting prior to meeting Josh and the crew. So I had held probably 4 or 5 protests prior to meeting anybody in this production. So it was, I felt that it was very important. I've been an advocate for the drivers here in Tampa for about 4 or 5 years. I am right now, took a halt on driving due to the pandemic. I haven't driven since October, I think, of last year, and was having issues with driving prior to. I was also involved in another startup company as well, so I was focusing more of my time on there. But when the pandemic hit, I readjusted my focus again and decided that I would help drivers once they passed for gig workers to get unemployment. So I sat here in my home and I helped drivers with signing up for unemployment, made sure they were up to date on what the process was, and providing feedback, all of that as well. So that's where I'm at right now.
Great. And we're joined here by Jacqueline, who's been working on a current campaign to make sure that drivers like Cheryl in California are protected and have the fallback of a social safety net. So Jacqueline, do you want to talk a little bit about your campaign?
Yeah, the Payoff Campaign is actually a national campaign, but it started about 2 years ago when companies like Instacart and DoorDash were using tips as a way to lower pay, and we're actually bringing down the pay per order to as low as $1 or less. And we launched a pretty successful campaign, I think, on that issue, where we were able to get tips back, but they cut the pay again. And so it's been a long fight since then. Gig workers really value flexibility very highly, because I speak to a lot of gig workers who have disabilities or who are single parents, or just people that need a job that can be done in a flexible way. And these gig apps really take advantage of that need for flexibility. We're seeing that even more now during the pandemic. And because like flexibility and pay are such key issues and they're really tied together, we're fighting for policies that would give gig workers, not just basic pay standards, but other protections that would maintain their flexibility. We're advocating for a pay floor per job of minimum wage plus expenses, tips on top, and full transparency about how these apps work, because the algorithms are often like really opaque, and it's one of the ways that they are able to drive down pay. I think Cheryl was talking about that, where when you first start, you are often paid a lot more than the gig workers who have been doing it for longer, as a way to bring people on and get them into the work. Recently in Seattle, we won policies specific for gig workers, giving them sick leave and hazard pay during the crisis. So gig workers now get an extra $250 per job that they do until the pandemic is over. And we're up against companies that want to both control workers and limit flexibility, as well as driving pay down. And right now we're really focused on fighting against Prop 22 in California, which is just a prime example of the gig app spending, I think it's $200 million in ads to do exactly that. The companies that are sponsoring Prop 22 say that it's going to protect independent contractor status and maintain that flexibility that gig workers really need, but it's actually going to redefine independent contractor status and allow companies to limit flexibility in such a severe way, as well as driving down the pay. And so we've been organizing gig workers in California to make sure that workers who have been misled by the company's ads understand what Prop 22 will actually do. I wrote a long report of all of the things that Prop 22 would actually do, but one of them is that it would create a pretty significant pay ceiling for gig workers. They say that they're promising 120% of minimum wage guaranteed per hour worked, but when you actually do the math and you take out expenses and you realize that they're only counting active time worked as, time when you pick up the food, for example, and drop it off, it ends up being something closer to like $5 or less per hour. The other thing is that they would be able to restrict the amount of hours that gig workers work on each app to under 15, which is pretty bad. They're promising that they would pay a healthcare stipend for any gig workers who work over 15 hours, but there's no language in the bill that says that they wouldn't be able to restrict how many hours someone works. I can answer more specific questions about Prop 22 if anyone has them, but I don't want to go on and on about it because it is very bad. I think the most important thing to know about it is that if it does pass, any future regulations on gig work would need to pass in the California State Senate with a 7/8 majority, which is just, near impossible. Very difficult to get 7/8 of politicians to agree on anything. So if it passes, future regulations on the gig economy would be very difficult to make happen.
Looks like there's some questions popping up here.
Yep. Actually, this question is a perfect segue. The question is, what is One Fair Wage doing to support rideshare drivers? As I mentioned at the beginning, my name is Yamila. Thank you, Jacqueline, for giving that overview about the great work that you're doing mobilizing, and Cheryl for sharing your lived experience, and Josh for making this film to highlight some of these injustices that I think, honestly, the everyday consumer doesn't realize. And so One Fair Wage, the organization that I represent, is a national organization which is seeking a full minimum wage for all workers in the U.S. to lift millions of tipped and sub-minimum wage workers nationally out of poverty by engaging these service workers civically and working toward greater racial equity and reducing sexual harassment, which, Cheryl, you speak to in the film. We are doing this through 3 pillars of work: policy shift, industry shift, and narrative culture shift. So the narrative culture shift actually fits in really well. It's talking about movies to highlight the lived experiences of service workers and what corporations like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, as well as big restaurant trade association lobbies are doing to keep workers' wages low, keep them from getting protections like earned sick time and other fallback fair scheduling measures. We know that the growing trend towards the gig economy, we published a report called The Gig is Up, the new gig economy and the threat of subminimum wages last year. And it was in doing research for that report that we found a lot of similarities between what the restaurant industry has done for a long time, which is rely on a subminimum wage and then have customers compensate between the subminimum wage and the overall wage to make up the difference. But we know that employers should be paying their workers' wages, not customers subsidizing workers' wages. And that you talk about in the film too, Cheryl. Mm-hmm. So we're fighting through these fair wage measures in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois, DC, and New Jersey. Actually, in Pennsylvania, we just introduced the most progressive legislation that also includes Uber, Lyft drivers. It includes nail salon workers. It includes car wash workers. Anybody who has to rely on tips for a living, who we know over the last 7 months of this pandemic have been so severely impacted because we know that tips are down 50 to 75% right now. And at the same time, workers are having to enforce mask mandates from the very customers that they're relying on for their wages. And so not only is it an issue of economic justice, but this is an issue of public health and safety because these service workers are literally the front line of defense. And they have to essentially be health marshals, as one of our worker members calls it, to tell customers to put on their mask. We've heard horror stories from workers, from women saying that customers are telling to them, oh, you'd be a lot less pretty if you didn't have to wear a mask, or I'd tip you a lot better if you didn't have to wear a mask, or I'd like you to pull down your mask so I can see what you really look like and decide how good of a tip I'm going to give you. Or making comments like, oh, I would like to use that mask in the bedroom. These are just a handful of the stories that we hear every single day from workers who we knew were in crisis and really struggling before, but the pandemic has just really lifted the veil and exacerbated the issue and made, I think, the country realize the reality that a lot of service workers were living tip to mouth, as we call it. So we're doing this through advocating for policy shifts, creating an industry shift, lifting up the good actors, the independent restaurants, and any other company who wants to work with us on creating fair labor practices and creating a commitment to fair labor practices. And then through narrative and culture shift activities like movies and film, movies and TV shows and books and earned media to kind of really push the narrative that if you're calling us essential workers, then we need to be paid as such. It is not worth it for us to risk our lives. And I say this from firsthand lived experience. I was a tipped worker for 10 years and my brother's an Uber Lyft driver. I shared that before the panel. Yeah. It is not worth it for our family members to be risking their lives for sub-minimum wages, for not even the promise of a full fair wage. So that's the work that we're doing. I'm going to drop a link in the chat so you guys can follow along to what we do, or you could go to fightdon'tstarve.com. But I would love to turn it back to Josh and Cheryl to talk about both the film and how it fits into, like, I think a good question to kind of explore is, like, have you thought about what would have happened if you had made the film now, or if you would be filming now with everything that's happened in the light of the pandemic? Or Cheryl, can you think of yourself now going back, realize, because we all think like, wow, things were so much different in February of 2020 or when you were making the film.
Yes, it was different then. I have to say though, I think the only thing that was really different was that there was a pandemic. Like all the other things that you're talking about were still there. They were just maybe hidden and maybe not spoken about, but all the other things about like the comment minus the mask, you know, I've dealt with a lot of that over the 6 years that I was driving for Uber and Lyft. So yeah, a lot of the issues were still there. They just were buried. I think the pandemic, what it did is it brought all the essential workers out, right? And it's the little man that's the essential worker minus the medical care profession. You know, of course they're essential, but they had to be there. You know, that's what they did. Now how do people get their food? And all of a sudden you started seeing the essential worker was the low paid wage middle-class worker, barely surviving. So to your question, if this film would have been in February, they probably wouldn't have been getting much filming from me, because I have a low immune system. So I wouldn't put myself in that situation, to where also I wouldn't put my family in that situation. So I probably would have, I mean, just like now, I'm not driving. I'm still not driving. When we have cases of 5,500 come up today, we saw in Florida, I'm not ready. I don't feel comfortable with that to get out there yet and put myself or my family in that position yet.
It seems like the attitude of the companies is stayed largely the same. And, I think that even though this was made obviously before the pandemic, I mean, one of the things we were very aware of in conceiving of the documentary is that most people have taken a ride from an Uber or a Lyft driver. I don't think, some people have obviously thought about what it's like for the driver on the other side, but how much do they know about what it's like to be on the other side? And that's obviously something that we were really dedicated to capturing and allowing the audience to experience it from that point of view. And to highlight, one of the things that I was most struck by when we started researching the story and started filming with Cheryl, and I don't think that this is well known by the general public, is the way that these companies have systematically cut the percentage of the ride that they pay to the driver. Systematically, over the course of years, in almost regular intervals, they come out with, and Cheryl can talk to this, but they come out with an announcement on the app, a new contract you have to sign, and all of a sudden your rate has changed. And they're claiming that these are independent contractors, they set their own, they have autonomy, and so I think that's a really important, I hope that comes through as a really important, I think, message that we wanted to try to convey. I was wondering, Cheryl, if you wanted to talk a little bit about, one of the things that struck me as we were filming is how difficult it was to organize drivers, unlike in a more traditional environment where a union forms, like a factory floor, let's say, or something like that, where workers are standing shoulder to shoulder, having lunch together every day. These drivers are all sitting in their own cars in the parking lot. They're all waiting. They're all competing against each other, ostensibly for rides. And so it seemed like you had to deal with very particular challenges in trying to get them to think collectively. I wonder if you could.
By the very nature of the work, it's like I've talked to folks who have organized domestic workers. The work is very isolating. Like you said, you're sitting in your car or you're working out of a home that's not yours. Yeah. You kind of see tidbits of that when you're all like grouped together in the airport parking lot, waiting and chatting. Yeah. And I love the conversation where you're like, in other countries, they know sorry, that's my dog shaking off. Yeah. In other countries, they know the power of withholding their labor, and they can mobilize thousands and tens of thousands of workers, and we can't even get a handful to withhold their labor for a few hours. That was really powerful.
Yeah, because in the beginning, when this started, I was saying this yesterday on another interview. In the beginning, when we first started, on the app, there literally were cars. You could see where the other drivers were sitting, so you could separate. You could move yourself out to where you knew you were going to get a ride, so you could kind of move away from the other car. Or they also had our names on the car, so I knew that maybe Tim was sitting 3 blocks over. So I would take that to my advantage. I also, for Lyft, I was a mentor and a recruiter for Lyft. So what I would do is I would be like the front line person to meet that new driver that was coming on board. I was onboarding him. And in the beginning, they had that position. But until they took away, all of that, within a couple of years, they took away all of that. They were no more inspecting cars. Like I literally would inspect the cars, the vehicles, go through the checklist, make sure the cars were safe, meet the driver, see if he had the personality, to drive, to be in a setting like that, because, you are picking up strangers. So I got to meet all the new drivers. And also with another gentleman, a couple other guys, we got together and we built a Facebook group so that we could just so every time I met a new driver, I would say, hey, join this group, right? So as it was growing, this group was growing and growing. I was meeting more and more drivers, and we used to have meetups. So there was camaraderie in the beginning, but then they started seeing, hey, maybe camaraderie is not so good. So because now drivers are going to talk to one another. That's the thing. We're going to talk. So then next thing you know, their names were completely gone off the cars. Then they took the cars completely off the map, so you couldn't see where the other cars were. So you were just like out there. It's kind of like they stripped it away, you know, from you. And so now you were just out there sitting by yourself. You felt alone. I actually created a Zello channel for all the drivers that we met and on the page, and we would sit and use it as a walkie-talkie and like keep each other company all day long so we didn't feel alone. Or if one of us got in trouble for a safety reason, got in trouble with a passenger or a car broke down, we had an immediate way to get help from one another. So I set that all up as well. And so then at that point, I was building camaraderie among the drivers because Lyft and Uber did not want us to know what was going on. That's how they kept, when they, you know, we started out at a certain amount. In the beginning, I would make $4,000 or $5,000 a month. And then every year, the pay just kept going down and down and down to where they're like 80 cents here now. After they take their cut, you're lucky. North Carolina is 35 cents a mile, and so is Chicago. Imagine that, 35 cents a mile. We get more from the government when we pay our taxes. So, you know, it's
and that's
insane.
Before all of your costs, your insurance, your maintenance, your gas, everything. Yeah.
Oh, and not only that, we had to add it to our insurance out of our own pocket. Like we have to have a rider, you know, a rider on our insurance saying that we're covering our passengers. We have to have, it's law here in Florida that you have to have 100. You know, so we had to up our insurance amount. So I watched my insurance go from $180 almost up to over $300 a month. Okay, so now I've taken on that and I got maintenance on my car, I got my gas, like these drivers. So now the new drivers nowadays, and this is the other thing, you know, what the new drivers don't understand these days, right now in this time, these new ones that are coming on board, is that they're coming into an already built market. The market has been built for them. We built it for them. The veteran drivers built that market for them. We're the ones that was out there in the streets, handing out cards, trying to make an extra $5 for a promo code if they used it, you know, street teaming, gathering drivers together. I would street team all the time. I would get a bunch of drivers together and we would just go out and hit the streets in heavy, you know, like bar areas, football games, and we would just pass out cars left and right. So we built the market. And that's why I say they don't know their value, because these companies, what are they without their drivers or their delivery drivers or their grocery shoppers? They're absolutely nothing but an app. They don't see the power that they have because these companies also put fear. Uber and Lyft were really great about putting that fear inside these drivers that they'll retaliate. I didn't care. I was out there. I was all over the news. I had drivers that supported me, a lot of drivers, who I know to this very day. We're great friends. We became great friends, like a family. And, you know, I still tried to encourage camaraderie among the drivers. So it takes a lot. Somebody asked me, had you ever organized before? That I've never organized in my life, but I knew that, hey, all I have to do is just get them in one place, tell them to get the message out, make them understand what's really happening. These new drivers nowadays, there's no camaraderie. They don't understand what they could have, like what we had in the beginning before they just started cutting. I remember a couple years, I think it was like 3 or 4 years, maybe 3.5 years ago, they dropped Tampa down to 65 cents a mile, and I got drivers together. And they can watch it on YouTube. It's on YouTube, Tampa protest. We got 50, 60 cars. We wrote messages all over our cars. We went through the streets in all the heavy areas of where the party is going on, you know, the heavy street bar areas in downtown Tampa where we could gain notoriety. And we just drove down the streets. I can't drive for 65. We wanted passengers to know they're being taken advantage. It wasn't just about us too. It was about the passenger as well, because the passenger is being taken care of as well, or taken advantage of as well. When they start adding those taxes on them, like they're hitting the passenger an extra $10, and they say they didn't want the drivers to be racist by names and this and that, but the companies themselves were actually being racist, because if you're going to up a price in a rich area to get picked up, than someone that's going to pay a lower fee in a lower income area. It's happening. It's happening.
So I know, Jacqueline, you're seeing a lot of the misinformation, fear tactics, and intimidation happening on the campaign that you're working on now. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, or just mention, I think the important thing too that people always ask in discussions like this is like, what can the consumer do? How can we help? Do we tip more? Like, I have an answer for that, but I'd love to hear your response, Jacqueline.
Yeah, it's honestly very hard to know if tipping more will actually be beneficial, because I hear stories all the time from gig workers that are really unsure if they're actually getting their tips. And because I don't know what the algorithms are on these apps, I can't say, if they're right or if they're wrong. And I think that that's that's intentionally done, because it pits people against each other and it makes them question their own experiences. Like, am I doing a good job or not if I'm like constantly receiving very low or zero tips? Or is it the app trying to punish me? I know that when I did Instacart, I had my phone open next to a friend who also did Instacart, and we were looking at the same jobs and seeing that mine sometimes were just $1 or $2 more than hers for the same exact job. And so is that a glitch? Or am I being offered more because they think I'm worth more? Am I better? I don't think that's true. So it's very confusing. I would recommend, if possible, tipping in cash. And one way that you can signal that you're going to tip in cash is if you tip 22 cents in the app. A lot of Instacart workers will know what that means, and a lot of food delivery workers will know what that means as well. But as far as fear tactics go, I would say that right now, every Uber and Lyft driver in California that I've spoken to has said that when they open the app, they have to click a button that says like, yes, I am voting yes on Prop 22 before they can start work for the day. And they have to do that every day. I have heard from people that they've been... Oh, sorry.
No, it's not legal. How can that be legal?
I have no idea. I don't know if it's legal or not. I'm not sure what the rules are with doing that for independent contractors. I know it wouldn't be legal if they're employees, but yeah, I've heard that that's what people see on their phones. I've also heard of people getting sent materials to their home for them to display in their cars, saying, I'm a rideshare driver and I love it. Vote yes on Prop 22 to support me. I've heard from Instacart workers that when they are packaging groceries, that they have to put in yes on Prop 22 messages in the grocery bags, and that people have gotten canvassed at their home by Instacart employees saying that they need to vote yes on Prop 22. So I've heard from people that they're very scared to speak out about how they actually feel, because they think that the apps are tracking, who is saying that they're voting yes or no, and that they're going to penalize people who say that they're voting no. I've also heard a lot of fear that the apps are going to leave California if Prop 22 doesn't pass. I personally don't think that will happen, because California is such a huge part of the economy, but I totally understand that fear. I know in Seattle recently, when we passed hazard pay for gig workers, Instacart threatened to shut down, but they only did it for a day. But even a day that's a lot of money. I know that when I was doing Instacart, I could make a couple $100s in a day. That would be the difference between paying my rent or not. So that it's very scary for people that are experiencing that.
Yeah, I shared this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Josh.
Oh no, I just wanted to point out, because I think on this topic of intimidation, I certainly experienced, in talking to drivers and filming scenes with Cheryl, talking to other drivers, the tremendous fear that drivers had with being filmed talking about the companies that they were driving for and their criticisms of it. So I just want to point out how brave Cheryl was to be completely out there, unfiltered, in terms of her experience, in terms of her criticisms of the labor practices. She let us into her car to film her giving rides. So she really,
among other things.
I just wanted to acknowledge and for people watching this to understand that took a lot of bravery. I mean, there were a lot of drivers who were convinced that if they said the slightest bad thing about Uber, they'd get dropped from the app permanently. So.
And
I'll tell you, I'm still live on the apps, both apps, by the way. And I'm sure that Uber's heard about this film. There's no way they haven't, but I'm still live. And I kept trying to explain to them, they can't retaliate against you. If they retaliate, then you have a lawsuit against them. But there was times when Josh can tell you, he would even walk near with the camera. And these drivers are like, don't film me. I don't want to be on film. Like, no. And it was crazy. It really was. They were afraid.
I just have one thing that I want to add to that, which is that right now there are a lot of undocumented people that are working on Instacart and that have started working on some other gig apps. And so there's an added fear there that, any kind of retaliation would result in some pretty serious consequences, such as deportation or something. And Instacart technically doesn't allow undocumented people to work on their app, but there's a lot of third-party apps that do give undocumented people access to working on Instacart. So they just have an added layer of fear and lack of protection. And that's been increased very much since the beginning of the pandemic, where many people who lost whatever jobs they had before have moved to gig apps. And I know that Instacart is aware of this.
I have to tell you that too. What they also do is get another person to sign up for them, and they use that app. They carry that phone. They use that app to work. And that's happening. There are a lot of things happening, you guys. There are things that would just blow your mind that are happening, but it's happening. It is. It really is. There's ways around it. They figure out that way around it.
To follow up on the question, how did you find Cheryl for the documentary, Josh?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we really, because we're starting from a place of, looking for something very general, in the sense that just looking for a gig worker who had a story that seemed like it would be something that would play out dynamically over time, and someone who would, participate in the way that for the style of film that we were making, we needed to have the kind of access that we had. We needed to be able to allow the viewer to create to develop hopefully a strong relationship with the protagonist. And when we started, we first went to Denver, because we had read about drivers sleeping in their cars in the airport lot there because it just wasn't worth it to them to burn the gas to drive home. Talked to a bunch of people there. Ultimately, we're drawn to Tampa because Tampa had been hit so hard by the mortgage crisis, and Cheryl's story, obviously, it intertwines with that story, because she lost her job in the crash. But when we started talking to drivers in Tampa, everybody said, you got to talk to Cheryl. She was already like the known leader of people and the lot. As she mentioned, she'd been organizing protests. She had put together this channel. You hear a little bit of the channel that she mentioned, the kind of walkie-talkie channel in the film in the first scene, maybe one of the others. But so we talked to Cheryl, and she was a little hesitant at first, maybe, but thankfully she agreed to participate, and she stuck it out. It's not always easy having a film crew follow you around for days at a time, which we did. So she was a trooper, and we couldn't have been happier. I mean, the story played out in such a in such a, I think, emotional and relatable way that, hopefully, as I mentioned earlier, really brings these issues to, the whole goal was to bring these issues to light in a way that, was more than facts and figures. That these were people whose experiences you could, if not identify with them as experiences that you had had yourself, but you could empathize with them. You could put yourself in their shoes and understand what it was like for them. And I think we've seen since the film has been released that audiences and critics really have connected with Cheryl and her experience. So, Cheryl, do you want to talk a little bit about what it was like to participate in the film?
Yeah, everybody, I heard, I don't know if you listened to the podcast, but I listened to a podcast, and it was, I was laughing because she said that I was just, a fly by the seat of my pants kind of girl, which, yeah, I was not, I was shy. Before I started lifting Uber, I was not let's just say, I wouldn't say necessarily really shy, but I was not a person that would just walk up to a stranger and start talking to them, not even in a bar or whatever, that just wasn't who I was. But since I started doing Uber and Lyft, I could talk to anybody. I could talk to a stranger. I could find commonality with them now. So it has changed me as a person. It's not all been bad. So, I was telling Sarah that I would get really stressed out when I knew that they were coming to film. Like, I would just get so stressed out. So, of course, you didn't see that. I don't even know how. So I would have to literally put myself in a different mindset. I'd have to say, remember why you're doing this. You're doing this for all of the drivers. This is, you got to finish what you started, because that's just the person I am. I finish what I start. But it was an experience. I will say it was definitely an experience, probably something that would have never happened in my lifetime. So I'm very grateful for that. But I'm even more grateful. It just really seems ironic to me right now that the film came out and then a pandemic hit, and how the stories we were trying to tell kind of just fell right into place. It was like, it's just unbelievable to me that it happened like that, So it really is, if you think about it. So
to follow up on that, actually, I guess, what protections would you have wanted as a rideshare driver, and what are you hearing from that's the question from the audience, but I'm just going to tack onto that, and maybe Jacqueline can speak to this too. What are you hearing from your colleagues as far as access to PPE? I've heard about a lot of workers having to install plexiglass in their cars as a barrier. Are customers riding less now because of the pandemic? What protections would you have wanted, and what protections do you know your colleagues are fighting for?
At one point, I know back, I would probably say 2 months ago, the ridership here in Tampa was down like 75%, almost 80%. So imagine drivers were not making money. Now I still think it's about 65%. Florida has opened up completely. The governor opened up everything. I don't know what he was thinking, but okay. I won't talk about that, my views on that. But I'm hearing from the drivers, like I had one, I mean, like I said, we're good friends and I stay in contact with them. Plus I moderate 4 drivers pages. So, I'm always trying to stay in contact with them. But one sent me a screenshot of his ride. He said, I'm not doing this again. I don't care what they do to me. I'm not doing. So what they do is they give you a ride, right? And then they say, you have to do a stop along the way. And whether you want to or not, you have to do that stop. So he got the ride, and apparently there was a stop. So it was a short ride, and it took 15 minutes, almost 16 minutes to do the ride. Uber charged the passenger $10 and something. He made $3 and something. Now you do the math on that. Okay, he's like, I'm done. I won't do. If there's a ride, if there's a stop in between, I'm leaving them there. I'm not doing stops anymore because there's no money in it. You're sitting there burning your gas to keep your car cool for the passenger, one, your time and you're making $3.87, it's not right, that advantage that they're taking them. So I still hear, some I hear I'm making good money. And I said, I wouldn't brag about it because you're really only making good money because there's still a lot of drivers that are not driving due to health issues, their age, there are a lot of drivers that are still not on the road and they're still drawing their unemployment, like me. Our unemployment is $125 a week. You cannot really survive on that. So
that's actually, sorry, I didn't mean to cut
that's
you
okay.
off, Cheryl.
I think
I was just gonna say,
I think they're forced back to work because of that, is what I was going to say.
I just wanted to elaborate on what you just said about unemployment, because this pandemic has absolutely created a crisis for sub-minimum wage workers, for gig workers, who most have not received sufficient government relief to survive, or government aid. They haven't been able to access unemployment insurance because of the complicated nature of the pay structures, both the sub-minimum wage for service workers who live off of tips and for independent contractors. It's very confusing. I'm not sure exactly what the threshold is. And so many are going back to work because of the very nature of that. Maybe Jacqueline, you can speak to that too.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, a lot of people are attracted to gig work because traditional employment doesn't work for them. I have spoken to so many people who started doing gig work. I started doing gig work myself because I have a chronic illness, and I needed to be able to take off from work if I wasn't feeling well. I know a lot of other people are in the same situation and so are even more at risk now that COVID-19 is out in the world. In the very beginning of the pandemic, all of the apps said that they were going to pay sick leave for anyone that had the coronavirus. But what they didn't say is that you needed a positive COVID test in order to access that sick leave. Now, it's been 7 months, so I don't know if, there's been so many things that have happened, but in the very beginning, you couldn't get a coronavirus test. You couldn't get tested for it unless you had been out of the country. And that didn't change until, maybe April. So I spoke to quite a few people who had coronavirus symptoms, went to their doctor. Their doctor was like, well, you probably have coronavirus. We're not going to test you for it. We're recommending that you self-quarantine. And then they brought that information to the gig apps that they work on. And the apps were like, well, you don't have your positive test, so no sick leave for you. And I shared a story that hopefully will get shared in the chat, but this person, Jonah, was a gig worker who had become homeless because of how poorly, the gig apps were paying, was already in a very precarious situation, wouldn't have even gone to the doctor at all if he didn't think that the doctor's visit was going to be covered. But because he didn't have a positive test, he wasn't able to access any sort of sick leave, and was having to make the very difficult decision of, does he continue working because he's not getting paid to stay home and he needs to pay for the hotel that he's staying in, or, and put other people at risk, or does he do the right thing and stay home and take care of himself, but then potentially lose his housing? And it wasn't until we publicized this story and other people shared their own stories that eventually they changed that policy. But I don't know how many people were harmed in the meantime. And I know that Postmates and DoorDash for a long time were charging gig workers for the PPE that they had. Back in March, when it was really difficult to get hand sanitizer, they were charging their gig workers who needed it to have it. They were charging people for masks. And I know that, the charge wasn't that much. It was like $5. But $5 is what some people make after doing 2 or 3 jobs. So that's actually a lot of money when you think about how much they're paying, and they really shouldn't be charging anything at all for something that's necessary to do the work. I know that now that's changed on some of the apps, but even still with some of them, they make you pay for shipping, and it really is a huge problem.
I do want to touch a little bit, thanks for that, Jacqueline, Josh, on the other subjects or vignettes, as you call it, in the film, and kind of how the stories weave and work together really well. I know we've talked a lot today, just because of the nature of Jacqueline and I's work, about fair wages and working conditions for service industry workers and gig economy workers, but how the kind of stories of the decline of the middle class, or the hardships faced by less factory jobs, as we've seen, and how, what led folks to the gig economy, and how it works with the other stories.
I mean, how they weave together?
Yeah, sorry, to be clear, how the stories weave together, how they all come together to tell this common narrative. Well,
I have to tell you, I mean, that was one of the biggest challenges of this project. And it was actually, it was sort of like a thing you couldn't know how it was going to work out until you did it. And so that was something that anytime you're enacting totally storylines that don't have any organic points of overlap in the narrative context, I mean, it's challenging. We cast, the protagonists that we did in part because we thought that their stories could play well off one another, and that, over the course of their stories, issues would emerge, these sort of points of synergy between them would come out. But we really didn't know at the beginning how it was all going to work, to be honest. I mean, and that's just kind of the nature of making an observational film, and especially an observational film where you're trying to weave these stories together. You really just kind of, you trust your instincts and you roll the dice, and you hope that you can make something out of it. And we were, it took many months of moving pieces around, and just trial and error in terms of figuring out the structuring and how to make them fit together in a way that felt like seamless and it made sense. And they, I ultimately felt really good about, what we were able to do with that. And that's, a lot of credit goes to, we had a fantastic editor by the name of Lynn True, who did an amazing job. This was a very challenging editing film to edit. So there's no magic. It was, it was wrestling with the ideas, wrestling with where these points of overlap in these stories. I think that when certain things would happen in one story, it became clear, there's sort of a turn in the film where, it goes from being about kind of the economics that each of the three protagonists are dealing with, and then you start to see the ripple effects on their families. And that was something that we saw unfold organically, and knew that there were those points of overlap, and that the story could be deepened thematically by bringing those things out. So I hope that answers your question. It's a tricky thing. There's it's trial and error, it's instinct, and as we were making the film, we were constantly, Sarah and I were constantly having conversations. Where do we think that this is headed? What do we think this means? How do we think this relates to the other stories? But we actually started out, there were 5 stories we were following in the beginning, and 2 of them just didn't seem to fit in. It really kind of emerged after the first 6 months or so that Don, Pete, and Cheryl really felt like they formed this triumvirate that was going to tell the story that we wanted to tell.
Yeah, I think for me, the juxtaposition of Pete being laid off from the traditional kind of union floor job that you mentioned in the beginning, which was where workers have a voice and a vote, and they can bargain for fair wages, and they can fight for fair contracts. And that Cheryl's trying to do a similar kind of, I mean, as a labor organizer, I was drawn to that story. Cheryl's trying to do that very similar thing, but in a very different atmosphere, where it's a challenge for all the things we talked about: the isolation of the work, the money and power and influence that companies like Uber and Lyft have, not just over their drivers, but over legislators, spreading the misinformation. And so it's a real uphill battle in order to fight for wages. And because of the very nature of the kind of flexibility that they preach, that they've almost interwoven their narrative to the American public to say, like, well, if they don't like it, they can just, turn off the app and go work somewhere else, or go.
And the drivers have really imbibed that message.
The drivers drive that message.
Drivers will tell you that, and they'll cut their rates in half, and they'll just say, well, if you don't like it, you can just leave.
And I said, I've worked. Yeah, I said I've worked 6 years. This is my business. This is a business. And that's another thing. I think what a big thing was too is that in the beginning, like, people didn't take this job as a job. You know what? They looked at it like fun, because that's the way Uber and Lyft presented it. Oh, have fun, get picked up by a Lyft car with a big old mustache on the front. Uber, you need a black car, you need a driver. They went more executive, and then they had to, once they started, they had to bring it back down, And the other thing is, you were end up in areas that sometimes you didn't want to be in, especially as a female, So these drivers are like, if you don't like it, go find another job. It's like, you know what? This is a business. This is my business. I have worked 6 years doing this. This is not fun. I mean, that work when you want to work. No, if you're doing this full time as a business, you're working. You're working 60, 70 hours, 80 hours a week, because that's what you have to work right now to make a living, So it's not like, okay, you're self-employed, work when you want to work. Well, you're not going to pay your bills if you just work when you want to work. You have to work every day, just like a regular job.
One more thing on the 3 stories. This is an imperfect way to describe them, but to your point, I used to sometimes think about Don as the past, Pete as the present, and Cheryl as the future. I mean, in a way, what Cheryl's dealing with is the present. It's not the future. But in terms of sort of looking at it from the vantage point of like work in America, Don is trying to hold on to, family farming, which is just dying. I mean, they're just getting bulldozed by consolidation. And, Pete is trying to reinvent himself through that. And Cheryl is dealing with this whole new, world of gig work that we've been talking about. So that sort of, the fact that they're in kind of different, dealing with the changes in industry in different ways, was important in creating this kind of kaleidoscopic whole that we wanted to create.
Thanks, Josh. Cheryl, do you have anything to share? I know we're nearing the end of the hour here, so I would love to give everybody just one opportunity to share 1 or 2 minutes of some closing thoughts, call to actions, how people can help, how people can think about the future of supporting gig workers like Cheryl's colleagues.
Yes, my last words is I hope a lot of drivers are watching this. I put this out to about 4,000 drivers. So here's what I got to say to you. I'm still here. Neil said to me yesterday, or actually 3 days ago, you still have them signs in the garage? I said, yep, I do. I'm still here. I still have your back. I'll still go out there with you. Just because I'm not driving the car right now, I'll still go out there with you. I just want you to realize what you are worth. Realize your worth. Don't ever let anybody make you feel like you are not worth it, because you have to realize your own worth in order and fight for what is right. Don't let people take advantage of you. These companies are taking advantage of you. So that's what I got to end this with is I'm still here.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl. Jacqueline, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, that was great. I think, if there are any gig workers that are watching this or anyone that wants to support gig work, I'd ask you to sign up with the Payoff Campaign. We're really trying to get the word out right now about all of the different exploitative things that these gig apps are doing, and we're organizing all the time to stop them from doing it. We just passed hazard pay in Seattle. Something's happening in San Francisco pretty soon, and we're trying to pass protections and pay standards for gig workers all over the United States, and we can't do it without as many gig workers as possible getting involved. Right. And especially right now, if anyone is willing to spread the word about how terrible Prop 22 is, especially if you're a gig worker, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of gig workers are being led to fear what will happen if it doesn't pass, and not voting yes because they like it, but voting yes because they're afraid they're going to lose their income. So getting the word out about that is really important right now. We have 2 weeks until Election Day, or less than that. 12 days, I think.
I don't honestly know this. I mean, I have some sense of it, but I'm wondering if someone could speak to the difference between the two presidential candidates in terms of what they've articulated or what they've demonstrated in the past, their policies towards laws around independent contractors. No.
I will say that, whenever we have had a phone call with the Postmates executives, they love letting us know that they used to work in the Obama administration and that they care about workers just like us. And that's why they're paying them 7 cents a mile. Mm-hmm. So I think that no matter who wins, we need to push for better pay and better protections for gig workers. I think we'll have a better chance with Biden, but it's going to be a fight no matter what.
I mean, the Trump administration has not been very labor friendly. I think that's safe to say, right?
Yeah. That's right. So the Department of Labor under Trump has tried to roll back crucial labor protections developed under the Obama administration and before that. Specific to one fair wage, eliminating the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, Biden-Harris campaign has endorsed that in their 3 agendas: their jobs agenda, their gender equity agenda, because 70% of tipped workers are women, so it's a gender justice issue, and the racial equity agenda. I didn't talk about this, but the sub-minimum wage is a literal legacy of slavery. It is important to mention the history of sub-minimum wages in America and reliance on tips. After emancipation, it was a way to pay newly freed slaves $0 and give them a tip to make up their wages, or to constitute their wages. And we've gone from a $0 minimum wage then to a $2.13 at the federal level that tipped workers are forced to live off of. So I can just speak to that as far as labor protections and then what the Biden-Harris campaign has promised to do. But as Jacqueline said, our presidential and federal and city elected officials are our opponents to build our movement and our organizing from. So at the very least, we're starting from a level that we can actually move. This current administration is not one that can be easily moved, because they are bought and represent corporations and corporate greed and capitalism at its worst. Just in my closing thoughts, I echo what Jacqueline said, which is strengthening protections to limit the use of misclassification of independent contractors and employees, which places an undue burden on workers, these law-abiding employees, and the economy as a whole. Ensuring all tips and gratuities belong to the workers and are not used to offset wage guarantees is really, really important. New York City passed a law that would guarantee rideshare drivers a full minimum wage with tips on top in 2019, and we celebrate that, and we think more legislation like that should roll out in other cities. And lastly, just to talk to people. I think that was like a beautiful part in the film, Cheryl, both when you were talking to one of your clients or customers or riders, as you call them, and she was like, "What's it like to work as an Uber driver?" And another thing that I loved that you said in the film was, "I never backed down from a fight." No change was ever created from people backing down from a fight. We've seen this from drivers speaking out about conditions, as Jacqueline represents, and service industry workers that I represent, saying it is not worth it to put my health on the line. I'm not getting unemployment insurance. My employer is struggling, but we're struggling more.
Yeah.
So talk to your coworkers about it, talk to other consumers about it, because consumers really do have the purchasing power, and we have purchasing power as we have our power too as workers to withhold our labor, as you illustrate in the film.
Right.
And Josh, maybe it would be appropriate for you to close this out, since it is your co-film.
I appreciate everybody for tuning in and for watching the film, and would love if you enjoyed it to let other people know. It's streaming now on most of the major platforms, including on Google Play, iTunes. So and independent films like this really benefit from people spreading the word, and as I mentioned earlier, our coming at this as filmmakers, we came from a set of concerns about the direction the country was headed in terms of the economics for working families, but the way we really tried to create an impact with that was to create an emotional experience of their lives that would get beyond the facts and figures and help people really feel their experience. So the more people that can be shared with, the better, and hopefully it will change some minds and some good will come of it.
Thanks, Josh. This is a beautiful testament to storytelling. Cheryl, thank you for sharing your truth and allowing us to learn more about what really goes on behind the app. And Jacqueline, for your great work in advocacy and organizing, specifically on a monumental campaign like the one that you all are working on now. I encourage you guys to check out her work. Thank you, Josh, Cheryl, and Jacqueline. It's been a pleasure to share tonight with you all. I look forward to telling my friends and family about this film.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.